For decades, the world saw the Russian army as an unshakable force, forged in iron and discipline. But in 2025, across the ruined fields of Kursk and Donetsk, that image is collapsing. Soldiers are refusing orders, generals are disappearing, and what once was loyalty has turned into fear and despair. With no morale and no real command, Moscow is trying to sustain the war with recruits dragged from forgotten villages. Today, you're going to see how Putin's empire began to rot from the inside out, and why Russia's greatest enemy now wears a Russian uniform. After more than 2 years as the aggressor, Moscow finally got a taste of its own poison. For 30 months, Russia crossed borders, destroyed cities, and believed it could win through sheer brute force. But in August of 2024, the unexpected happened. The war crossed the map. Ukraine launched a lightning offensive in the Kursk region, marking the first major incursion into Russian territory since the beginning of the conflict. Suddenly, the trenches switched sides. For the first time, the sound of missiles wasn't coming from the west, but from the Russian sky. The operation was surgical. Assault units supported by drones crossed the border at multiple points, targeting ammunition depots, supply lines, and logistical centers that sustained the Russian front. In just 48 hours, entire villages were captured, and local Russian forces, made up mostly of conscripts and regional police, simply abandoned their positions. The psychological impact was devastating. For decades, the Kremlin had fueled the narrative that Russia was an impenetrable fortress, a nation built to project power, never to be attacked. But Kursk shattered that myth. Images of Russian armored vehicles burning on Russian soil spread across Telegram before the Ministry of Defense could censor them. Nearby cities went into panic, and inside the army, the feeling was pure humiliation. How could the country that invaded Kiev now be forced to defend its own border? The Ukrainian offensive on Kursk didn't just expose a tactical mistake, it laid bare the structural failure of the Russian army. When the first battalions crossed the border, what they found wasn't hardened professional forces, but frightened, poorly trained recruits with no clear command. The defense of Kursk, one of the most symbolic regions in Russian military history, was left in the hands of conscripts, young men between 18 and 20 years old, drafted by obligation for a single year of military service. They were supposed to be cleaning barracks, driving supply trucks, or serving as guards in support facilities. But in August of 2024, many of these boys were pushed directly to the front, in direct violation of their own country's laws. The result was both predictable and devastating. In just 3 days of fighting, entire units surrendered. Nearly 600 Russian soldiers were captured and taken as prisoners of war, a number that shocked even Western analysts. The images of those young men handing over their weapons and seeking refuge in Ukraine became a symbol of an army in moral collapse. But to truly understand the scale of this failure, we need to look inside the Russian military system. Putin's army is divided into two categories: the kontraktorniki, professional contract soldiers, and the conscripts, who serve by obligation. The kontraktorniki are professionals. They receive a salary, go through intensive training, and form the backbone of the combat units that have operated in Ukraine since 2022. They're motivated by contracts, benefits, and, in some cases, ideology. Conscripts, on the other hand, serve only 12 months of mandatory service, with basic training and no real combat experience. By law, they cannot be deployed outside Russian territory, a rule Putin himself repeated publicly at the start of the war, assuring that only professional soldiers would fight in Ukraine. But Kursk broke that promise. When Ukrainian troops crossed the border, there simply weren't enough professional units to hold the line. With no other options, the Kremlin took internal service recruits, handed them rifles, and told them they were now defending the motherland. These conscripts had no coordination, no morale, and no preparation. Some were seen fighting with old rifles without proper body armor. Others didn't even know how to operate radios or identify enemy drones. The Russian Colossus revealed what many inside the country already knew. Behind the propaganda and the parades lies an army divided between the elite and the expendable. And that division didn't stay on the battlefield. It echoed through families, small villages, and social media. The mothers of those young men began to ask the question everyone in Russia feared. Why were their sons dying on Russian soil in a war Moscow swore would never come home? The war in Kursk shook the very social foundation of Putin's regime. For years, the Kremlin kept the country united under a simple formula: While the big cities lived in relative stability, the countryside paid the price in blood. It was a calculated strategy of division. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the major capitals were spared from mass conscription. Those regions housed the country's intellectual, financial, and technological elite, people with access to the internet, influence, and the power to mobilize. Recruiting them would have been a political risk Putin never wanted to take. So the burden of the war fell on rural areas and on ethnic minorities from peripheral republics. Buryatia, Dagestan, Tuva. Those populations, far from the political center and more economically dependent on the state, became the human reservoir of the war. While young men from Moscow went to universities and offices, young men from forgotten villages came back in sealed coffins. But the invasion of Kursk changed everything. Suddenly, the war was no longer something distant. When missiles began falling inside Russia itself, the special operation narrative collapsed. The possibility that urban conscripts could be sent to defend Russian territory set off alarm bells. Families who once ignored the conflict began to fear the draft. And on social media, even under censorship, videos started to appear. Silent protests, mothers shouting in front of enlistment centers, and posts asking, "If we're only defending ourselves, why are our sons dying inside Russia?" Civil unrest, once localized, began to spread. But the most dangerous shock for Putin didn't come from the streets, it came from the palaces. Because the oligarchs, the economic pillars of the regime, began to feel the financial collapse reaching their own doors. Their relationship with Putin has always been symbiotic. He guarantees protection and contracts, they guarantee loyalty and money. But the war destroyed that balance. Western sanctions froze bank accounts, seized yachts, and blocked investments. Russia lost access to strategic energy and technology markets. And to make matters worse, Ukrainian strikes on refineries and oil depots have already cut nearly 15% of the country's refining capacity. A direct hit to the Kremlin's main source of revenue. With that, the elite began to question whether the Putin business was still worth it. Some have even spoken out, indirectly, but unmistakably. Oleg Tinkov, founder of Tinkoff Bank, called the war insane and renounced his Russian citizenship. Mikhail Friedman, from the Alpha Group, criticized the sanctions, saying that the war destroyed what we spent 30 years building. Both faced immediate retaliation. Their companies were nationalized, their names erased from the press. But the message was clear. The circle of loyalty has started to crack. The Russian economy, still surviving on state control and improvisation, is becoming a ticking time bomb in the hands of the Kremlin's own billionaires. And as the cost of war keeps growing, the question changes tone. It's no longer, how long will the West hold on? But how long can Russia keep pretending nothing is falling apart? After Kursk, Ukraine made it clear that the war had entered a new phase. It was no longer about defending borders, it was about taking the fight to the heart of Russia. On August 21, 2024, a series of coordinated drone strikes hit depots and power stations in Bryansk and Moscow. Less than 3 weeks later, on September 10th, another wave traveled more than 800 kilometers, striking refineries and logistical bases near the capital. The targets weren't just military, they were symbolic. Each explosion carried the same message: Russia is no longer safe. This new offensive stance proved that Ukraine had learned how to wage war intelligently. While Moscow bet on quantity, Kyiv invested in precision, coordination, and courage. Drones, sabotage operations, and surgical strikes turned Russian territory into a zone of uncertainty. And with every successful operation, Western support reignited. Right after the attacks, Washington and Brussels announced new aid packages. And the most symbolic moment came in November. The first F-16 fighter jets began arriving at Ukrainian bases, ready to enter combat in 2025. The message was clear. The West was betting on a Ukrainian victory again. But while Kyiv advanced boldly, Putin was running out of options. His nuclear threats, repeated endlessly since 2022, no longer scared anyone. Every time he mentioned buttons or devastating responses, markets reacted less, and the world understood. It was all a bluff. The Kremlin now faces what it fears most: a dead end. To sustain the front, Putin needs more men, but that means another nationwide mobilization. And every new wave of recruits brings more angry mothers, more protests, and more desertions. The same population he kept detached for years is now feeling the direct weight of the war. The numbers tell the scale of the disaster. Western estimates point to nearly 700,000 Russian casualties between dead and wounded, against about 500,000 on the Ukrainian side. Even with greater manpower, the bleeding is unsustainable. No empire can survive when it must trade thousands of lives for every kilometer of ground. And the more the army wears down, the clearer it becomes. This war isn't being lost only in the trenches, but in the minds and the wallets of the Russians themselves. The war Putin promised to win in a matter of weeks has now dragged on for more than 2 years, and it's consuming Russia itself. From Kursk to the strikes in Moscow, what we're witnessing is an empire coming apart, soldiers surrendering, conscripts being sacrificed, and even the Kremlin's own billionaires starting to back away. The machine that once sustained the regime, the army, the economy, and the propaganda, is collapsing under the weight of its own lies. Today, Putin's greatest enemy isn't in Kiev, but at home, in the streets, in the barracks, and in the lavish offices of his former allies. And as the support of both the people and the elites slips away, the question is no longer if Putin's regime will fall, but when. What do you think? How much longer can Putin hold on to power? And if you think this is the lowest point of the Russian army, think again. Because right now, Moscow is pulling Soviet-era tanks out of storage, restoring scrap metal and sending them back to the front lines. Click the video appearing on your screen and see how these zombie tanks just hit the battlefield, and why even Ukraine couldn't believe it happened. And don't forget to subscribe to the Military Ground. See you there.